Hey, Joseph, you should have access now.
Okay. Your hair looks great.
Sounds.
I do. All right, guys, we're going to jump in. So I'm going to jump into Form 310, which is what you should see on the screen right now. You see the agreement to buy and sell real estate? Give me a thumbs up if that's what you see. Okay, so what we will do is I'll go through this like I do before. Obviously, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt, throw it in the chat box, whatever it may be. But I'm basically just going to go through, talk through the contract as if I were walking through it with a client, so you guys can get used to that, and then point out any areas that we're seeing jump out right now to make sure that we are covering them. First part is going to be the parties to the contract. So buyers and sellers, obviously that's going to be, if you know who the parties are, if you're the buyer's agent and you can get the parties from the listing agent, that'd be great. First place to start would be the tax records, but also understand you may want to confirm that with the listing agent to make sure. Questions that get often answered here is, do the parties on the contract have to match the parties that are going to be on the mortgage? That's going to be more of a question for the lender as well as the attorney. However, they don't have to be a lot of times. So if you have a situation where somebody's going to be added to the deed later, you could always do that. From the seller standpoint, if it is an estate, or if it's someone who's a representative of the estate, you still would have the actual seller's name in here, which would be the estate party, and then it would be signed by whoever the executor of the estate is. And then we got some definitions: party, brokers, closing attorney. This is where you would put a closing attorney, section C. It is not required to be in here. Closing attorney is who the buyer will have coordinate the actual closing, and that does not mean the seller has to use the same attorney. Seller can pick whatever attorney they would like. Effective date is going to be the final date upon which the parties in negotiation have placed their final signature and or initials, and that's where everything moving forward will be from the effective date. Good funds is going to be the transfer to the required amount of dollars within any required time frame, and then time and all stated shall be South Carolina local time. Time is of the essence with respect to all provisions of the contract. What time of the essence means is if it has a time frame, it is important. And if you don't hit the time frame, then obviously you will miss a deadline and could be in breach or voiding the contract. This next part here is where you would disclose whether or not the buyer or the seller is a South Carolina real estate licensee, meaning they are licensed. They have an active real estate license. That can be in referral. That does not have to mean they're part of the association or anything like that, but if they are an active licensee, they needed to disclose that here. Then the next part is where you're disclosing, or the buyer and the seller are disclosing, that they acknowledge the receipt of the brokerage relationship form, and they've chosen whether or not they're going to be a client or a customer in this transaction. Okay, so it does need to be initialed on here to make sure that you do so. All right, section 2, purchase price. This is going to be the purchase price of the property. It is either going to be 100% cash, which means it's going to come from cash. The second part here, it is going to be 100% finance, which is not very often, or it's going to be a combination of financing and cash, which is going to be the majority of them. And then you would say verification of cash is available. That is available is either attached or not attached, or to be delivered on or before. If I'm the listing agent and I get an all cash offer, I'm going to either want it attached or to be delivered before a certain date. You want to get proof of funds. And then the next part talks about whether or not the contract is contingent upon the sale of a buyer's real property, and then whether or not Form 504 is or is not attached. So a couple things on this one. Number one, big thing that's coming up right now, or not a big thing, but a couple things that are coming up right now. Lenders who are guaranteed financing. We've had a couple of situations where a lender has said, hey, we have an approval program that basically says, we guarantee that this will close. If not, we will cover the costs of any lost earnest money or any inspections or anything or repairs that the sellers had to do to get out of, to perform on this contract. That's nice, but understand if you do not put the contingent on financing on the next page because of that, and the financing falls through, that the buyer can be in risk of a lot more than just losing their earnest money and having to refund the seller some repair money. We'll get to that when we get to it, just something to keep in mind. Second thing is if I'm the listing agent and this is contingent on the home selling, I would not want to accept it without having Form 504 attached. If you do not have Form 504 attached as far as the home sale contingency is concerned, you're basically keeping this open-ended with that contingency until the closing date on here. So there's no protection for the seller should the buyer's home not go under contract. So just important part to remember. All right, section 3, the property itself. Section 3 describes the property and what it is. Going to convey, the buyer is going to buy the lot or parcel of land, the interests, improvements, landscape systems, and fixtures, if any, or anything further described below, which is what you would put under property. Seller agrees to maintain in operable condition the property and the personal property conveying in the same operative condition, including any landscaping, grounds, and any agreed upon repairs or replacements from the effective date till the closing date, subject to normal wear and tear. Reason it's important to go through that is that the seller needs to understand if they put in here personal property and let's say the refrigerator or any of the appliances are covered here below, that they need to be maintained in operable condition until closing. So if you've got a refrigerator that doesn't have an ice maker that works or has some sort of problem with it and that's included in here, you're going to want to disclose that before you sign the contract, because if you go to closing and then all of a sudden they go out there or they go to inspection and say, well, and it's repair procedure, they're saying, well, the ice maker doesn't work. They're going to argue, well, it was working at time of showing. All right, and then you get into the debate. So you just want to make sure that personal property is subject to that, regardless of whether or not it's due diligence or repair procedure. Another important part of this first paragraph for section 3, buyer acknowledges the opportunity to inquire about owners association issues, common equipment, common area issues, condominium master deed issues, assigned parking, storage areas, memberships, lease issues, and finance equipment prior to signing the contract. Prior to signing the contract. So if you are purchasing in a neighborhood with an HOA or a condominium association or any type of association, it is actually the buyer's right and privilege and kind of their obligation to inquire on the HOA prior to going under contract. If you go into repair procedure and not due diligence, and let's say you find out that the HOA has an upcoming assessment, barring the seller knowing about it and not disclosing it, obviously that's a different story, or they don't have insufficient funds in their account or anything like that, it technically would not be protected because that should be information you get ahead of time. So something to keep in mind if you're representing the buyer. And then the last part of this page, obviously the property description, right? You want to put the address in there. The big things are going to be your address, your tax map number. If you can get everything else off of the deed, that would be great. Definitely do so. If not, you want to make sure you dash them out, make sure they can't fill anything in there, but want to make sure you have the address, the tax map number, and that they match. And then the last part is personal property will convey unless described below, and you can either describe it in these 2 lines or check off an attachment, and you can have an attachment that could either be a bill of sale that with 0 amount, or you could just have a document that lists out the items that will be conveying with the property. You would just want to make sure you get those signed and initialed by both parties. All right, questions so far on page 1?
What about window treatments?
Window treatments would not, I mean, it's a gray area. So if you want them, you should put them in there. The treatments themselves, it just depends. I mean, you could argue how they're attached. There's no hard written rule on what that looks like in South Carolina. Which, by the way, I mean, it brings a good question up. If you are at a listing presentation before you go on the market, I always tell the sellers, listen, if there's anything in the house that you do not want to go with the house, take out now. So if they've got a lot of nice window treatments in there and they want to keep them, it's probably better to get them removed prior to going on the market, unless of course they're super elaborate and would cause an issue. At that point, they probably want them to stay anyway. Anything else?
I have a question, Joseph.
Yes.
Going back to time is of the essence with respect to all provisions of the contract.
Mhm.
Like I had a listing and I put in seller will review all contracts, say like 4 days later or whatever it was, put it on market Sunday, and they're going to review the offers on Thursday. But then I got offers that said, a 24-hour time period. They wanted to respond in 24 hours.
Right.
So I really didn't deal with that. I just they knew that the seller wasn't going to respond until Thursday, and I just didn't say anything, and they didn't say anything to me.
Right.
But it have a date in there prior to the Thursday.
Yeah, so the best thing for that would be is to, if it's an offer you feel that your seller's really going to consider, obviously you need to present it regardless. When you say sellers are going to respond Thursday at 5, it doesn't mean you don't present the offer right away. The law requires you present the offer in a timely manner. So if you're getting offers Monday and Tuesday, I don't think I would not advise waiting till Thursday. That being said, if you get one where they have a deadline that's shorter, you would want to ask the listing agent or the buyer's agent to say, hey, they have reviewed it, but they are not responding until Thursday. They are considering your offer. So if you would like for them to respond, we would ask that you send us an amended contract with an expiration date that's after Thursday. Because if not, and they respond, you technically have a voidable contract if they respond after the expiration date. Again, none of this matters until something goes wrong.
Right.
So, it may not be an issue, but I think in this market right now, I'm double crossing all my T's and triple dotting all my I's. So in that case, I would write back and say, or just pick up the phone and say, Patty, I've got your offer. I noticed the expiration is tomorrow at 5. They're not actually going to be responding until Thursday. Do you mind sending me an updated one?
Should they
That
just
would be-
put that on the offer or put an addendum that the time?
It'd be the easiest to just strike the offer and change it. Strike
Okay.
the one part of the offer.
Okay.
Yep. Good question. Anybody else? All right, section 4, page 2, conveyance closing possession. So basically this says closing date will be 5 p.m. on or before whatever date. This is the most important one. Time is of the essence. 5:01, this hasn't closed, it's a dead contract. Doesn't matter why, there's no automatic extension, nothing. If you didn't hear from the lender, you didn't get an extension, you don't have a contract. There's no protection period, there's nothing in the law that says there's a grace period, nothing. And the reason I reiterate that a handful of times is because we've seen that lately. Last minute stuff comes up. I get it. I know a lot of us are used to the old grace period that was in there. It's not there anymore. So you just need to make sure you pay attention to, don't wait till 4 o'clock to say, well, we got to get this figured out before you start asking for an extension. If you think an extension is going to be needed, go ahead and get the ball rolling that morning or as soon as you can, so you don't have any worries about that. This is the part 2 where it says the sentence has come up quite frequently. The sellers agree to convey marketable title with the property, free of encumbrances. And in liens except herein stated. So basically it's you're telling them as the seller there's no problem with the property. What has come up on this is finding out about forbearances that need to be paid off, right? And they're saying, well, I didn't know about it. I can't afford to pay that there was nothing in there that stipulated specifically for your forbearance payoff. Liens that are also could be considered a lien or a leasehold would be, what was the other one that we saw? I'm drawing a blank. Solar equipment, things like that could be on the house that need to be paid off or the seller has to pay off. So you want to make sure that it's free of any encumbrances.
Would that also include, Joseph, would that also include HOA fees that sometime associate put liens on property because?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. If an HOA is put on a lien on a property, any mechanics liens, any liens that are against it.
Okay.
Can you explain a little more about the solar panels? Because that's like new to me.
Yeah, so a lot of times people, the solar panels are technically financed and but sometimes it's put on as a lien to the property because it's not, it's a personal loan or it's a personal, one could suggest it's unsecured financing. However, it could be tied to the property. So if they do put the lien on there and it has to be paid off, or if it's not paid off, then the buyer technically the seller can take it with them, right? If it's just financing they got on it and they wanted to take it off, that's fine. What you don't want them to do is leave it on the property and then have an outstanding loan on it, and then they don't pay it off, and where that loan may not be assumed by the buyer, the solar company could still come and repossess the equipment, right? So that's why you want to make sure all that is secure. It's not a clean cut situation. They're not fantastic. All right, section 5, earnest money. You have a total amount of earnest money, and then you have a certain amount that's either delivered it's accompanied with the offer, or will be paid by 6 p.m. on blank date. Unless they've actually gone in and turned the earnest money in, at the time of submitting this, because we don't hold earnest money, right? So the buyers are going to be taking that to the attorney's office. So if they've not presented that with the offer, then I would select the second one, that it will be paid by 6 p.m. on blank date. And this really shouldn't be much longer than the next day. If I'm the listing agent, I don't want it much longer than the next day. Unless you actually have the money that has been accompanied, you know it's been turned into the escrow agent, I would not, so I'd have 0 in this blank where it says accompanies the offer, and then I'd put the total amount on the second blank by a certain date. It's either in the form of check, cash, or wire. Can be credited to the buyer at closing, and then this talks about who the escrow agent is that holds it, and that's selected by the buyer. A lot of times they're just going to pick who their closing attorney is going to be. It doesn't really matter as long as it's a selected escrow agent. Earnest money is not required. It's not a required item of a contract. So a lot of people will argue about, what the minimum amount is, or that there is no minimum amount, there's no maximum amount. It is not a required part of the contract. However, it is a giant form of leverage. So it is important to at least clearly understand what the expectations are of it. Now, the important part is if the earnest money is not delivered by the agreed upon date above, seller may, doesn't have to, may terminate the contract by delivering notice of termination to the buyer. There's no time frame on that. However, you do need to understand that if you are the seller and you have not received the earnest money by the date above, you have the unilateral right to terminate this contract, which means as the buyer's agent, it is your fiduciary responsibility to make sure that you say, Nancy, it is 1:55 and our earnest money is due by 6 p.m. today. If you do not have it in at 6 p.m. today, they can unilaterally pull the contract away from us.
Yeah,
So-
Jason, point on that. That's why when you put a date in there, I like to put 2-3 days out, because it may take 2-3 days to even ratify, depending on what's going on. So if I put the next day, that limits time. And I don't think they
I would
really
change,
put 3 days out.
I would change the date as I negotiate. Because the South Carolina Association of Realtors, SCR, will say if it's not going to be the day of the ratification, then the only option should be due diligence. They shouldn't have a repair procedure or anything else if they don't have the earnest money coming in right away. Because you don't have any leverage. Let's say you have a repair procedure and it's 2 to 3 days out and you ratify right away. Let's say we had this happen. If they ratified right away, the earnest money wasn't due until, let's say, just use this week as an example. They ratified today, earnest money wasn't due till Friday. They got the inspector out tomorrow. Inspector came out, found, nothing that was covered, but found enough things on there. The buyer was like, you know what, I don't feel like purchasing the house. And yeah, I know it's repair procedure, but I haven't turned in my earnest money yet. I'm not going to turn it in. Now all of a sudden you've got a buyer that's breached a contract that doesn't really care because they never turned in earnest money, even though the seller could technically, take court action and go after them. Did they? No. However, it did cause a little bit of an issue. But I see what you're saying with that, is it needs to be turned in, or if it takes a couple days to negotiate, which is why I would say if I submitted an offer today, I'd probably put Thursday at 6 p.m. knowing that if I didn't ratify by Thursday, then I can change the date. They also don't have to deposit it until it's ratified. So you could also have the buyer turn it in to the escrow agent and say, please don't deposit this until we give you notice of ratification.
Right. Okay.
So that way they can be turning it in while they could have turned it in while negotiating. It doesn't put their money at risk.
Right.
Can you put 2 days instead of putting a date?
No, you would have to put a date in there, because if you put 2 days, then it would be, at that point, you've modified the contract and it doesn't really give a provision for that.
Yeah. 'cause
I
they
mean,
did-
you could write in there within 2 days. But then the question becomes
Would
within
be
2
a
days of what?
ratification, because if you're working with an agent that is very slow on responding and you don't get an answer for 2 or 3 days, yeah, then you're constantly changing everything.
You could, but if it's, if the final, that ratification happens, then someone could have changed the date too. I think if you write in 2 days, you just open it up for a little too much of interpretation. The next paragraph basically in bold letters says that parties understand and agree that under all circumstances, including default, escrow agent will not disperse the earnest money to either party until both parties have executed an agreement authorizing the disbursement. It's important that you explain that, especially to the sellers in this market right now. that just because it is earnest money, and even if the buyer so just obviously blatantly defaults on the contract, earnest money is protected by the state. This is a legally regulated account, so it can't just be released to either party without the executed agreement authorizing that disbursement. And if there becomes a dispute, then we will go through the process, which we'll come back to here in a bit. But it's just important that they know that there's not a, even if it's the day before closing, the buyer says, you know what, I don't like the house anymore. Where that may seem very obvious, it's important to set the expectation that money just can't be signed back to the seller. It does have to be in an agreement by everyone. As far as this fee, escrow agent fees, court costs, anything, if an interpleader is to be utilized, parties agree that blank shall be paid to the escrow agent by the parties. Most escrow agents that I know don't collect a fee on that, but you would want to check with the escrow agent themselves, see if they do check one. So if you're like the Butler colleges, who most of us use, they do not have a fee that they put in here. All right, section 6, transaction costs. This section basically talks about the different transaction costs for buyers and the sellers. It kind of defines what the transaction costs. Now, this is an example of one of the many different opportunities in our contracts that we can use to help explain the process to our clients to help combat further confusion. So in this transaction cost part of it, I would take this opportunity to say to the buyers and the sellers, here are what the costs are going to look like for you, right? Now with a buyer, it's also important at this point to say, and most importantly, let's look at what your lender has sent you as an estimated transaction cost, because they're going to have the final say so in this. Which we're going to come back to, making sure you're putting yourself at the center of this as far as communication is concerned, but not as far as being the expert in every single part of the process. Seller's transaction costs, same thing, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. When you close on this, your transaction costs will include deed preps, deed recording costs, stamps, recording costs calculated based on the value of the property, and all costs necessary to deliver marketable title. I do highly recommend that you do give a net sheet to a seller. Here are the estimated costs, and in the email and everywhere else you say this is based on the information we currently have. This does not include any outstanding liens that we didn't know about. This doesn't include your current mortgage payoff. I'll let you put that number in yourself. It's just important to be reminding them of what their involvement is moving here forward. The reason I say this, we just recently had 2 situations, one on the buyer side, one on the seller side. On the seller side, seller gets to closing, sees that he's got roughly $3,000 in deed stamps. Absolutely refused to pay it. So he was never told he had to pay deed stamps. That should have been disclosed to him. He's not paying anything above his commission. Now, would he have been defaulted?
Disclose that to him.
Say that again?
Who should have disclosed it to him?
Well, it's disclosed here in the paragraph. Yeah. Well, right here, it's disclosed in the transaction. So I do think it's part of the agent's job to explain, part of the process of, hey, here are some fees that you will have. The difficult part of your question, Patty, is that I don't know that there's a specific legal answer to who should have done that.
Okay.
Right. I would say as their representative, as their seller, you should have been one of the people that did it. The other one would be the attorney. The problem is they're not going to talk to the attorney until down the road. It's not like a buyer. The buyer side's a little different because the buyer talks to their lender ahead of time. The buyer is supposed to be getting everything lined up. The seller doesn't really get a chance to get kind of all these costs. They're getting that information from you.
Okay.
On the flip side, we had a buyer, same thing. We negotiated everything out, got their closing statement, and their closing costs ended up being a lot more than they thought they were going to be, and they were very upset because we didn't ask for enough in the closing costs part of the contract. That, in my opinion, is more of an issue with the lender than it is the agent,
Right.
which is why if I'm negotiating at this point, when we get to, I'm jumping ahead and I'll come back, but at closing, seller will pay the buyer transaction cost not to exceed X amount. At this point, if I'm working with Patty, I'm gonna say, Patty, okay, we really need to get from your lender what a reasonable amount is here. And if there's a maximum amount, we have one right now where we actually negotiated out for them to pay more in closing costs than the lender would allow. because they had to bring a certain amount to closing for their down payment. So that additional amount had to be applied to prepaids, or excuse me, to a buy down and a couple other things, which the buyer didn't see as anything valuable because they were like, well, I'd rather have that cash come to me than to lower my rate by a quarter, you know, 1/8 of a percent, which I don't blame them completely. I kind of do, but point is make sure you partner up with the lender at this point to say, you know, Nancy, I know you're doing the loan for Patty. Patty, we're negotiating out what she would want to hear. What's a realistic number to ask for and seller paid closing costs, and invite them into that discussion. The one right before this is one that's coming back to kind of bite some of us right now. Is this all costs obtained from or pertaining to owners association, transfer fees, certificate of assessments, capital contributions, working capital, estoppel fees. It does specifically map out who pays that here. It used to be if you didn't mark it off, it was bad. They'd split it or somebody'd be mad. If you don't mark this one off, it says in here, it defaults to the seller's transaction costs. The challenge we're seeing is some of these neighborhoods have added contribution fees since the sellers have purchased in there. So they'll get the offer that says, hey, you know, here's a full price offer, all yada, 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 but you're paying the transaction fees. And the sellers will say, well, I'm not really, you know, we don't have one, so I don't care. So they sign off on it. Well, then they show up to closing, they've got a $2,500 extra fee on there. That was the capital contribution fee. So I would say as part of your checklist as a listing agent is to confirm with the seller that they've confirmed with their HOA that there are no contribution costs. And I would either facilitate that communication with the HOA and have it followed up with an email, or just have them do it directly and follow up with you. Nancy, yes.
I have a question. too.
Since I'm coming from somewhere else, is there something traditional that the seller does pay for, the buyer does pay for? What's traditional?
Not anymore, because they have this selected on here. I mean, it used to be traditional, the buyer would pay any contribution fees because it's like the buyer's buying into the neighborhood, so they should, you know, they should pay for that. But as far as HOA is concerned, that's why they've mapped it out. Here's who you're supposed to pay for. What was weird is it used to be the seller would pay for a certificate of assessment or an estoppel fee, and the buyer would pay any capital contributions. Well, now they're saying it's going to, based on this, it's going to be one or the other's paying for it.
Joseph,
Yes.
Jackie, I just want to point something out to everybody because I represented a buyer who bought in Wild Dunes. And if you're not familiar with it, Wild Dunes has the 1% of sales price. And we left it blank. So it says if no box is checked, these costs will be added to the seller's transaction. And they balked at it, the listing agent, and said that, well, everybody knows Wild Dunes has a transfer fee. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's an
issue.
example of why they put it in here. And then here's the problem in that situation is because it's unknown, you still cause an argument. So that's why it's important from the beginning to just make sure everybody's clear on that. You understand who pays for it. What ended up happening in that one?
Well, because it, you know, it was discussed with my buyers, but you know, the seller's agent never said anything until we got close to closing, and then it was an issue. And I pointed out that it was left blank, and that's when she said, well, everybody knows Wild Dunes has it. Well, no, and that's, you know, just because it was mentioned in MLS it wasn't on the contract, but Susie,
Well, and
Susie and I and the other agents ended up splitting it.
yeah, I mean, the challenge in that too is this isn't saying whether or not there is one. This is saying if there is one, who pays for it. And so that's why that argument on the listing agent's standpoint is like, well, nobody's arguing that there is one. We know there is one. Wild Dunes, you know, the contribution fee. Now, and this is also a perfect example. The Wild Dunes contribution fee was designed for buyers to contribute to the working capital of the fund when they came in. I mean, it makes sense that the buyer would pay it 100%, but it's, you know, in the contract. And it's also a good example too from both. This isn't just a buyer's agent, seller's agent. This is, you know, in that case, had that gone anywhere or gone before, you know, a court, that the seller absolutely would have been responsible for that based on what this contract says. But we don't live in the world of absolutes before the judge, because you're talking about a small portion of a big transaction. And so what ended up happening in this one is we didn't have an understanding, and then the agents ended up eating it because it was easier than this, going any further than that. So it's a good example. Thank you.
I have a question too.
Mhm.
Like I've received contracts where it puts the seller's going to pay those and it's a FHA or VA loan.
Mhm.
Not that the buyer is going to pay for
Okay.
that. Okay. And from what I understand with the VA loan, the buyer can't pay for that, nor can they pay for the CL 100 to be done. So,
Right.
the agent is presenting the offer and they're checking, the buyer's going to pay for this and the buyer's going to pay for that. Maybe they don't understand that with the VA loan, they can't pay for those things. Right? Is that your
Correct.
understanding as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's the part too, is why it's also important to engage with the lender ahead of time, because that would be a question to ask the lender. Is this something we can ask for the buyer to pay, or does the seller have to pay it? Because that will make a difference for that buyer in a multiple offer situation.
Yeah, it does. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because some of those like fees are one was $750,
Mhm.
that's a lot of money for people.
Yeah.
And it can be a lot higher, 800, 900.
Yeah. So you definitely want to find those out. It's a good thing to bring up. If you've got FHA and VA and you've got a situation you're going with HOA, you want to find out if that's even the buyer is even allowed to pay it, if that becomes part of the negotiation. So, all right, section 7, finance. So buyer's obligation of the contract is or is not contingent on finance. And then it talks about the terms of the finance. A couple of things I want to point out on this one. Number one is it either is or is not contingent upon financing. If they are getting a loan and their lender has guaranteed that it will close and they don't need to make it contingent on financing, and you mark off paragraph 2 here, or section 2, you do need to follow up with a disclosure or a basically an email, which we sent out a verbiage on it last week, and we can post it again, but that does need to be disclosed to the buyer that is a giant risk. Because what's happening is a lender saying, hey, Patty, I know that it's contingent, we don't have to make it contingent on financing. I'm so confident this loan will close that if it doesn't, we will reimburse you for the earnest money if you lose it, as well as pay for any of the seller's repairs or anything they did during the transaction based on this. The problem with that is it's not that if you don't do it on contingent on financing and then you can't close because your financing doesn't go through, you've defaulted on the contract. And by defaulting on the contract, you've actually opened yourself to exposure to more than just the earnest money, as well as any repair costs that the seller may have incurred. So it's really,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, if the lender is saying that stuff, can't you get that put in an addendum? And then therefore, if it doesn't approve, he's paying for all that stuff.
Yeah, he is. But then who's paying for the fact that they've defaulted on the contract? The house has now been off the market.
Oh yeah, I see what you're
Yeah,
saying.
it's all those other things as well. It's not a matter of whether or not the lender's paying for it. That I'm not worried about. I'm sure the lender will pay for the earnest money and the repairs. I'm worried about if the seller turns around and sues the buyer, takes him to court and tries to force him to buy the house. Now, are they going to do that? Are they going to win in that? Probably not. Is it going to cost your buyer time and money to fight it? 100%.
Right.
That's the challenge on it.
Because if they don't make it, it's because they lost their job and now they're not happy buyers anyway.
Well, correct. And they don't have any money to be sued for. Next part on it is obviously buyer shall apply for financing by blank date. This, in my opinion, should not be more than a couple days. I mean, they should have already applied for financing, to be honest with you. And then no unreasonable credit income conditions by blank date. I mean, honestly, this one is this initial approval letter should also be, I mean, a couple weeks is reasonable. Here's the paragraph that you really need to understand. 100% is right here. Final loan approval occurs when lender funds the loan. So it is always contingent on financing. Unless the buyer does something to mess up financing, wasn't honest on their application, didn't fulfill the application process, or didn't apply in time. When we just had this happen where the lender, the last minute canceled, wasn't able to fund it because of a change internally in lending, had nothing to do with the buyer. That would technically go back to the buyer under the financing contingency. It's important to explain that to your sellers. Say, listen, the final loan approval, at the end of the day, we're gonna do everything we can to have everything removed, any conditions removed, but this contract states final loan approval occurs when the lender funds the loan. So if the funds never come through that hasn't had final approval, that contingency will protect them. Now, I'm not talking about changes their mind on the rate, doesn't feel like buying anymore or anything like that. I'm just talking about if, the final approval. If the buyer changes their lender during the financing period, they must notify the seller within blank calendar days. I put, 3 to 5 in their tops. Important thing about that though is yes, you can change it. You can let them know. However, absent written approval by the seller, this is kind of a redundant phrase because they'd have to change the closing date anyway, and this is what this means. This is absent written approval by the seller. The buyer cannot change the lender if the closing date agreed upon in paragraph 4 will change as a direct result. So if your buyer comes to you and says, Patty, I'm changing lenders. Okay, great. We need to let the seller know, but understand that if they have to change the closing date, the seller does not have to agree to that. And you could be in default of the contract. So you need to make sure that new lender can close in time. If the seller and brokers are notified the inability to obtain financing during the financing period, either party may terminate this contract by notice. Okay, so again, this is an important one because this has come up a handful of times. This actually just came up over the weekend. How this reads is if either party are notified of inability to obtain financing during the financing period, either party may terminate this contract by notice. So we represented the buyer. The buyer basically had an issue come up with financing where the lender was like, I'm not gonna be able to close by Tuesday, and here are some reasons why. We put the seller on notice, said, hey, give us a day, we could figure it out and probably get it done. At that point, you've put the seller on notice. Technically how it's written here is they can then cancel the contract. They do not have to wait it out. So that's just an important part to know. All right, I'm gonna take a deep breath, stretch your eyes.
Hey,
Go ahead and
Joseph,
get to section 8 here. Yes.
going back to the financing contingency, the apply for loan by blank date, typically if it's if you've got a pre-qual letter in there, right, you can just put, hey, apply by date you're submitting the agreement. The blank after that, I mean, I've had that come up in questions so many times. I typically put it just a week before the closing date. I mean, does that date really matter? Is there anything we should really note there if we get pushback from the sellers? Like, could we push that date up closer to contract ratification date?
You can. I would just make sure that the lender understands that they're going to have to provide this pre-approval letter, right? I mean, because okay, so to answer your question succinctly up front, to me, it's no different than what we used to provide at offer, right? We used to provide a pre-approval versus a pre-qualification, which was basically what this is now asking for, but giving you more time to get it, in my opinion.
Okay.
So if somebody asks for you to get it sooner, I don't know if that's the hill. If I'm the buyer's agent, I don't know if that's the hill that I'm going to die on. As long as the lender is confident to give said letter.
Yeah, I mean, if our clients have given all the W-2 information, tax information, there shouldn't be an issue there. Okay.
Agreed. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So the big difference there is, hey, to note, there is a difference between a pre-qual letter and a pre-approval letter. Two different things.
Correct. Yeah.
Cool. Gotcha.
But it
All
seems like some of the mortgage people are using that pre-qual letter and now they're calling it a pre-approval letter.
It's not a perfect system, that is for sure.
Yeah.
It's not a perfect system.
Yeah.
All right. Repairs, section 8. 3 types of ways you can handle repairs: repair procedure, due diligence, and as is. Repair procedure. We're just going to go in order. Repair procedure is, the best way to describe it is pre-agreed upon repairs. So Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, when you sign this, this is basically saying the seller is already agreeing what repairs they will address, and they are not required to address any repairs outside of this. Okay, so it's important that the buyers understand that. So basically what this means is I'm going to walk through this paragraph here. What this means is you'll get inspections and we will deliver notice to the seller by 6 p.m. on this date. And we're going to let them know of any request necessary to place the heating systems, air conditioning systems, electrical systems, plumbing, water supply systems, waste systems that will be in operative condition to make the roof free of leaks, address any environmental concerns, and to make improvements that will make the home structurally sound. Okay, so Mr. Buyer, we're going to have the home inspected, and if anything comes up under those 8 or 9 things that need to be addressed to make them either operable or structurally sound, then the seller is required to fix them to stay in the contract. And if they do fix them, you are required to stay in the contract. It does not cover anything else. Okay. Now, once we deliver this notice, we put them on notice. Now, continuing to go down the paragraph, if we as the buyer fail to notify the seller within the time frame, that means we've waived any and all rights under this section. If the lender's commitment requires any additional inspections or certification, these are to be provided by the buyer, which means you would do that if you're doing an FHA or VA. And the buyer at buyer's expense shall have the privilege and responsibility of inspecting the structure, square footage, environmental concerns, including but not limiting to mold, radon gas, lead-based hazards, including lead-based paints, wetland study, buildings, heating systems, air conditioning systems, electrical, plumbing, water supply, water waste, as well as pertinent equipment or appliances. Upon seller's request, the buyer will provide a copy of the inspection report. Again, it kind of repeats itself. Basically goes in and says, buyer's going to have an inspection done on this, and then in the event anything comes up in the 8 or 9 main categories, they'll put the seller on notice. Then the seller has until this time to deliver notice agreeing or not agreeing to make the repairs in the buyer's repair requests. The costs of these repairs to the heating, again, repeat, heating and air, electrical, plumbing, water waste, water supply, system operable, roof free of leaks, environmental concerns, or structurally sound issues will be paid by the seller. Seller paid requests do not include home maintenance, flooring, fogged windows, grandfather coded issues, landscaping, preventative maintenance, cosmetic changes, home improvement, and energy efficiency. If the seller contractually agrees to make the requested seller paid repairs, the parties agree to proceed under the amended contract. Repairs to any other items are the sole responsibility of the buyer. So, in a nutshell, here's what happens in this situation. Buyer has home inspected. Anything comes up under the 8 or 9 things that are on there, buyer puts seller on notice. Seller has 1 of 2 options. Yes, I'm going to do them. No, I'm not. Buyer says, yes, I'm going to do them. Excuse me, seller says, yes, I'm going to do them. Everyone moves forward under the contract. Buyer doesn't have any option at that point. Seller says, no, I'm not. We move on to the next part of the paragraph, which we'll talk about here in a second. That's it. And it talks about the things that are not included, things that were not named on there that you should also keep in mind. Safety concerns. I know it sounds silly. Faulty smoke detectors, a cracked window, it's not leaking. Things like that that are a safety concern are not included. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just telling you it's not included.
Okay, but it can be included if it's a VA loan.
Correct, which is addressed earlier in the paragraph separately from that.
Okay.
Right. So that's, if it is included, and if there's additional things that the VA and FHA are looking for, then yes. Okay, now, if the seller does say, hey, I'm not doing it, or doesn't respond, which is why this whole area says that the seller does not timely respond for above or does not agree to make the seller paid repairs, the buyer shall within 2 calendar days. Now, there's an argument here as to what this 2 calendar days is. I would default to whatever the shorter one is. I know that's not a perfect science, but here's the deal. Because it says or does not respond, then obviously I would say then it has to be 2 calendar days from this, right? Because obviously that's the only date you have to measure. However, a lot of people are saying if the seller does respond prior to this date, let's say this date is Friday at 6 p.m., but they reply tomorrow, then they say this 2 calendar days is from when they replied. I don't love having it ambiguous like that, but I'm going to go with the shorter of the 2 just so you know you're absolutely covered. This is on discussion right now at the Forms Committee at the state level because it is confusing. So I would just say if the seller responds, you have 2 days as the buyer to make up your mind whether or not you're going to move forward. If they don't respond, you have 2 days from this date up here to do the same. Okay, now, if they don't respond or they say they're not going to do it, then you have one of 3 options as the buyer: accept the property in its present condition, which obviously would be contingent on Patty's situation if they were having Linden that did need things done. Negotiate a new amended contract, which clearly isn't going to be an option because they either haven't responded or said no.
Right.
Or terminate the contract by delivering notice. If you don't do either one of the 3, you have agreed to move on purchasing the property as is, as defined in the paragraph below. Questions?
Well, it sounds like the seller gets off easy. They don't have to respond, but I guess they could lose the sale as well.
Yeah, if they don't respond, it's just the same thing as saying no.
Yeah.
They don't get off. I mean, because if they don't respond by that deadline, it's actually it's not that they don't get off, because technically if they don't respond at all, it's different than if they respond saying, no, we're not going to do these because we don't feel their seller paid repairs. There's at least some sort of gray area in there you can negotiate. If you don't respond at all, you're basically not responding, and then the buyer at that point can unilaterally terminate.
Right. Okay.
All right, part 2, due diligence. The one that we're probably going to end up, just go ahead and brace yourself. There
Hey,
will
I got a
be
question
some.
before we move on.
Okay,
Upon seller's request, the buyer will provide a copy of the inspection. Like, do
Yes.
you recommend when you're writing out all the requests that the buyer wants fixed, send, if there's like maybe 25 and they want 12 things fixed, do you suggest sending the whole thing and saying there are 25 things here, but they're only asking for 12 to be fixed? Or not?
I do. I mean, I suggest sending it all. I don't know what the big secret is, right? So I would say send it.
It typically could help you significantly.
Yeah.
As the buyer agent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Joseph, this is Mahalia before we go on. I have to leave because I have an appointment at 2:45. I thought we was coming on at 1, but my question, you said there's a YouTube channel and I see that Jeanette asked the same question. Could you tell us where that at? I don't know I think Kristen may have sent it, but just to be on the safe side.
She has. We'll get them to send it. Yeah, we'll get them to send it out and post it on Facebook.
Okay, and I'll look at that tonight. Thank you for the knowledge. Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Call me
Okay,
with any questions.
yeah. Bye-bye.
All right, so let's go to due diligence. Bottom of page 3, second part of section 8. The due diligence period, which is, go ahead and brace yourself, what probably the contracts are going to be the only option moving forward at some point. They probably will do away with repair procedure and probably will do away with it as is, maybe not though. But basically what due diligence says is that there's a due diligence period that begins on the effective date and shall expire at 6 p.m. on whatever date that you choose on here, and any extension to this date must be made in writing and agreed by both parties. During that due diligence period, you basically have your right. The buyer may take timely, prudent steps to inspect, get any estimates, do anything they want, and then negotiate during that time any repairs, if any, that the seller is willing to do, right? So they'll get the inspections, part 1, they'll deliver repair requests, either via notice 525, they'll proceed under the contract and not change anything, or they'll proceed as it, which is basically the same thing as proceeding as is, or sorry, proceed under amended contract, which would be negotiated any repairs, proceed under an as is contract, or terminate the contract during this time. So basically, Mr. Buyer, you can leave, you can terminate this contract for any reason whatsoever, but by the due diligence period. Mr. Seller, buyer can terminate this contract for any reason whatsoever by the date of the termination period, for the due diligence period. What I would tell sellers if this were happen is, now I'm not saying you don't have a contract, but I wouldn't act like you have a contract until due diligence is over. Right, so I wouldn't make any long-term plans that you can't change until we get this. A lot of people hate it. From a seller standpoint, I didn't love it, still kind of don't, but I also understand there's something to be said to the very black and white nature of due diligence. Here's your time frame to do whatever you want, and then after this time frame, you're done, with the exception of any other contingencies that Jennifer brought up earlier, which would be CO 100, financing contingency, And what was the other one?
Appraisal.
Appraisal. Obviously, those would still be in there.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep. Now, during the due diligence period, buyer may unilaterally terminate this contract only by delivering to the seller both notice of termination and a fee of X amount. There's not a required amount in here, but I will tell you, if you want any chance of due diligence getting accepted in this market, this better be a big number. So how I would look at it is I would say if it's a 2-week due diligence, I'd do a rough estimate of what 2 weeks worth of carrying costs are on the house. So when I put in the offer and say, Patty, I'm going due diligence. I know it's not ideal to you compared to repair procedure. However, I'm willing to pay $2,000 should I terminate, or whatever the number may be.
Right.
Not a lot of sellers are even entertaining due diligence right now. However, this also goes back down to negotiations. There are still sellers that are taking due diligence. It's just a matter of what the situation is, explaining it to the listing agent ahead of time, finding out kind of what their most important hot buttons are. If there is no termination or amended contract by the due diligence timeframe, they are moving forward as is. So if you don't have all your ducks in a row and you've got termination of due diligence today at 6 and it's 2:30 and you're waiting to hear back from the seller, you better send them an email that says, if I don't have something back by 5, we will be sending notice of termination. Because at 6 p.m., if you don't hear back from the seller, even if you've asked the seller to change a $5 door lock on there, if the seller does not respond and you move forward past it, you're buying the house as is at that point. So very important to remember that.
Hey, what about that termination fee, Joseph? Does that have to be delivered with that termination?
Yeah, it
Well-
technically does. A lot of people will deliver the notice and then do release the earnest money and split it up. Because what they're doing is they're saying, just for round numbers, they're saying, okay, here's $5,000 in earnest money and we're going to give you a $2,000 termination fee. What they'll do is they'll deliver the termination and then they'll just release the earnest money, $3,000 back to the buyer, $2,000 to the seller. To me, that's not a big difference. However, how it's written, you technically are writing they should be writing a check of $2,000 directly to the seller.
Cool.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it makes it easier if you could just do that release rather than trying to track them down and giving them a check in hand.
Yeah, I mean, it does. It is a lot easier for sure. All right, now as is, pretty self-explanatory. Well, actually, I should say it should be self-explanatory. It's not though. As is, a lot of people just think that as is means, well, I'm going to buy the house, still have it inspected, but the seller's saying they're not fixing anything. Not only are they saying they're not fixing anything, they're saying you're buying it regardless of what you find out wrong with it. A lot of times people for years would say, I'm going to go due diligence and we'll just buy it as is because we know the seller's not going to do anything. That's fine. That's not what this means. This means that, hey, Lane, I'm buying the house from you as a buyer. You're the seller. And regardless of what I find wrong with that house, I have to buy it. I can get it inspected. There's a deadline for me to get it inspected. And quite honestly, I don't even know why there is a line to get it inspected. Because if I write it as is and I go get it inspected and Lane's built his house on top of a sinkhole that was once filled with nuclear waste, I mean, obviously, if he didn't disclose it, there's a disclosure issue. But let's say he didn't know and you find out all this about it, you're still buying it. So it's just important that everyone understands that.
But you still have.
I'm not sure why they have it.
You still have the contingencies in place that are in the contract, correct?
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, you still have your CO 100, you have it, but let's just say that happens too. Let's say the CO 100 is clear, right? And the appraisal comes in, everything else comes through, but you find out a bunch of other things that are wrong with the house, still obligated to buy it.
Right.
Yep.
Or they could get out of it with the appraisal if the appraisal
Correct.
is below.
Unless the buyer, well, here's the thing. Now the appraisal, let's say that happens. I offer Lane 250 as is. I find out all the stuff's wrong with the home. It comes back and appraises at 225. Lane finds out about all the stuff with the home too. And he's like, fine, I'll take 225. He drops the price to 225. I still have to buy it according to the appraisal conditions.
The seller doesn't have to sell it though, at that price.
No, but if he opts to do so, I have to buy it.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
All right, paragraph 9, section 9, inspection, reinspection rights basically says that the buyer does have the rights to inspect the place as well as have it reinspected. And then they can do a final walkthrough inspection of the property within 48 hours prior to the closing date. It's important to know that, because if you try to modify that in in the repair addendum, that can be a conflict. This says they can have it re-inspected within 48 hours of the closing date. So if you do your repair addendum and you say, hey, I want all these done 5 business days prior to closing, you're contradicting your contract. Now, if the seller agrees, then they've agreed, but just be careful on that. Says the sellers will make the property accessible for inspection with not unreasonably withhold access unless otherwise agreed to in writing by the parties. Seller agrees to grant the buyer right to perform a final walkthrough inspection 48 hours, which is talked about. Seller grants the buyer permission to connect utilities, pay for utilities, to hire professionals, electricians safely connected. This rarely happens unless it's a bank-owned property or an investment property that's been abandoned. But again, covers all the inspection rights from there. All right, appraised value, section 10, 2 options here. It is contingent upon the appraisal or it is not. It is contingent on the appraisal and the appraisal comes in low. There are a couple options. The seller can agree to drop to the appraised value. If so, everyone moves forward. The seller can make that unilateral decision for everyone. Or they can renegotiate to come up with a price, or the buyer can make up for the difference. If none of those happen, then the contract can be terminated with the earnest money going back to the buyer. If you have a contract where the buyer is saying, hey, I will pay more even if the appraisal comes in, that is fine. They can put that contingency in there. They just need to make sure that the lender will allow it. Most of the time they will. You just want to make sure that they will allow it, because if you get some government-backed loans, sometimes an FHA loan, they may not be able to afford the difference. If you also run the risk, if you don't have guidelines on there, you just have a blanket, hey, it's not contingent on the appraisal. They're under contract for $300,000 and the appraisal comes in at $250,000. If someone's doing FHA financing, they more than likely don't have an extra $50,000 just lying around to cover the difference. And if they don't, they're technically in default because it was not contingent on appraisal.
Well, I had a situation where it was like 22,000 above asking price.
Right.
And it was a VA loan. No, I think it was a FHA loan, I want to say.
Yep.
And, I asked the agent if he had the money to pay, the cash to pay the difference if the appraisal came out differently to the purchase price, if it became lower. And so she said she'd call him and she said, yes, he does. So if my person was going to go with that offer, 1, we would have proof of funds, and 2, we'd have an addendum saying that the buyer is willing to pay above appraised value if needed to match the purchase price. Would that work?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, here's the deal. Having it not contingent upon the appraisal technically states at that point that the buyer has to pay the difference. If you put in an addendum that the buyer agrees to pay the difference, it's a little redundant, to be honest with you, because when you're saying it's not contingent on the appraisal, that's the seller saying they don't care if it appraises, right? You've got to buy the house regardless. So in order for him to buy the house, he'd have to pay the difference.
That's even easier, just not
It
check.
is easier. A lot. People.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
good.
And what
You're
you
covered
can
in that.
do, what you can do is check that box. Hey, it's contingent upon appraisal, but then put that appraisal shortfall addendum in there, saying, "Hey, we'll cover up
Yeah.
to whatever amount."
Right, but I like what Joseph is saying.
Yeah.
You don't even have to add that addendum.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
if
as
you
long-
can get
but
away
just-
with checking the box.
Yeah, that just goes to the fact though of it kind of goes back to, okay, if it's 300,000, the price is at 250. If they can't afford the 250, if they can't afford the $50,000, this doesn't cover them and they're in default to contract if they can't move forward with it. Which again goes to your point, Patty, where you'd have proof of funds or somewhere along those lines.
Right. I think that's important, especially with the VA loans, the FHA loans.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and just for clarification, this has been asked a couple times now. If you have a listing and you go under contract for above list price, you're not to go in and change the list price in the MLS to help with the appraisal. You laugh. You laugh.
Really?
Yes, we were requested by one buyer's agent that said it's required to change the list price to what the contract price was. That is not the case. One could argue long-term it's perpetuating mortgage fraud, but just like you wouldn't lower the list price if it came in for less than, if you went under contract for less than list price, right? It's, you don't, it's the list price, right? So just, I don't make things up unless they've come across my desk. So Section 11 wood infestation report, otherwise known as the CO 100. It either is or is not contingent upon it. The buyer or seller have it inspected, buyer or seller pay for it, and the buyer or seller provide timely notice. My opinion, that the buyer should be selecting their own, the buyer should be paying for it, and the buyer should be delivering the notice because it's no different than an inspector. You just never know who the seller is going to send out there. The chances of them sending somebody, shoddy out there are slim to none. However, it's best to represent yourself. If you're the listing agent, you get this offer that says the buyer is going to select it, but the seller is going to pay. I would probably find out who they're going to get to do it first. There are some places that charge $200 something for CO 100s. And if you haven't put a stipulation in there and what you're willing to pay, the seller would be obligated to pay that when you can go get a reputable company to do it for less than 100.
I had
Notice
a
of
situation with the CO 100 with multiple offers. And I was just surprised that the agent put the seller to pay that in multiple offer situation. Several of the buyer agents put the seller to pay for that. And I was trying to think of what their philosophy would be to check that one. What do you think?
No, it's an interesting strategy, Cotton. We'll have to see how it plays out.
Okay.
Yeah, that was an interesting one.
Yeah, it makes sense for the buyer to pay for that. If you're the buyer.
Notice of and shall deliver no earlier than 30 days closing and no later than blank calendar days prior to closing. This is an important one. This is 15 days and the buyer is responsible for having it done, but does not have the property timely inspected by that 15 days, the buyer waives the rights of this. That's happening a lot. We're having, no later than 15 days and then people forgot and within 15 days, they're going to get the inspections because something's coming up. It's technically not covered. They waived it at that point. So be careful if you're going to have any calendar, 15 calendar days or something like that, that it's done within that 30 to 15. So you don't get caught in an area in there. So if something does come up, the three options, it's kind of similar to everything else. The buyer, if the seller agrees to address them, then everybody moves forward. Seller doesn't agree to address them, you can renegotiate. And then if you don't come to any terms, then they can be terminated by the buyer. All right. So the rest of this is a lot of disclosure. Section 12, basically saying a survey, title exam, elevations, insurance, that we all recommend that the buyers have the property surveyed. They have obviously a title examination, which they will have an elevation certificate, have insurance on the property. It's a disclosure. Survival, paragraph 13. If you have something in the contract that is required, it will be kept after closing, right? So if they were supposed to do something in the contract that they didn't do, technically, it does survive closing. However, just know that closing is your biggest leverage always. So unless it's something very, very minor, I wouldn't rely on that. Paragraph 4 talks about whether or not a home warranty is going to be attached, who's going to pay for it, what company, and it is also disclosed that there is a chance that one of the agents will be paid a processing fee or some sort of admin fee by the homeowner's insurance, or excuse me, the home warranty company. Section 15 says if anything happens, fire, casualty, or injury of the property prior to closing, parties have the right for 5 calendar days after notice of damage. Well, they have to put on notice, and then if that happens, the seller has the opportunity to repair all the damage. They can remit the buyer any amount sufficient for the repairs, assigning the buyer the right to all proceeds of insurance. And the buyer then, of course, at that point would take care of it, or the property would be, or the contract would be terminated. So if damage happened to the property during the transaction, obviously it becomes a negotiation again. Paragraph 16, this is a big one that's come up. Paragraph 16, it is contingent here, or it says on here whether or not they have filled it out. A lot of questions right now about the exemption form, and there are two lenses through which we need to look at this. Number one is the lens of the liability of the property, right? Liability of the seller is they've never lived in it, they don't want to fill it out. That's nice and all. However, they don't want to fill it out. The problem with them not filling it out is you're then not protected. So it is our stance, there should always be a property disclosure filled out on a property sold by a Keller Williams agent. Because the statute of the property disclosure protects the agents should something come up that was not disclosed on the property disclosure, that will actually protect us as the broker from any liability on that. Okay. So if your buyer or your seller says, I don't want to fill this out, I'm exempt from it, you can say, I understand that. It's actually, we do have a requirement that you do fill it out. You can put no representation though if you do not know, right? They don't have, it's not their obligation to go fill it out. However, if they don't have a property disclosure statement, then it opens us up for exposure should something happen down the road where something comes up on the property and there was no property disclosure. The one that people are trying to use as an out right now is under the exemption form with the LLR. There is an exemption option at the bottom that says buyer and parties agree that the seller will not complete it, right? Which is basically this second section here. That's just very risky. And honestly, it's risky for the seller too, but definitely risky for you as the agent. Section 17, lead-based paint. If it was built before 1978, we're going to disclose that there may be lead-based paint with the Form 315. Give you copies of all the pertinent documentation. Any information about sex offenders or criminal information, the parties agree that we're not responsible to give as brokers. They need to go find out on their own. In the event the escrow agent has an interest-bearing account, Section 19 is where they disclose they can place it in an interest-bearing account. I don't know of any of the escrow agents locally that actually have one. South Carolina income tax of non-residents. It says if you are a non-resident, or you will comply against the income taxes and you allow the attorney to pull out the adjusted taxes at closing. Entire binding agreement. This is basically saying that this contract overwrites any outside agreements that we have that modify the terms of the contract. Okay, so if there are any, this is one of the many areas throughout the entire process where you can't have outside agreements. Can't agree for the additional additional closing costs to go to the buyer under the table. You can't agree for the occupy after closing without it being disclosed, especially if you're getting rent. So just, this is something to keep in mind on that one. Paragraph 22 is the adjustments. Basically says the buyer and seller agree that at the settlement at closing that all adjusted costs will be prorated. The day of the closing belongs to the seller. So anything for taxes, HOAs, utilities that may be already prepaid, lease terms, anything like that will be prorated to the day of closing. Section 23 talks about the potential pitfalls of defaulting on the contract. This is really the only information you can give as far as advice is concerned. If a client is looking to default on a contract, you can basically say, here's what happens. And then here are the things that may be done by the buyer or the seller, depending on who you are to default. If you have any further questions, they do need to talk to an attorney on that. Paragraph 24 does say in the event that there's a conflict in this and to avoid litigation, we agree to try mediation first. It's not binding though. So if we agree to, if we don't agree to get to this, it's just kind of one of those where we'll try to do. Non-reliance clause basically means that you have entered this contract freely and voluntarily without any statements, representations, inducements, promises, or agreements by us as brokers. You've just been explained to it and you agree to it, is what it means. Broker's disclaimer. This is one of the many areas too where you say, I am the broker. My knowledge here is on marketing of the property and purchasing of the property in the process. I'm not a property inspector. I'm not an HVAC guy. You need to verify anything you want to know about site conditions, schools, zoning ordinances. Any of those need to be backed up by the professional in that area. Section 27 says the compensation will be paid at closing and it is negotiable, but the permit that the attorneys do have permission to disperse the compensation. Paragraph 28 discloses if you had any attachments. So if you did have Form 504 per se for the home sale contingency or anything there, you would make a note of it in here. Notice and delivery is basically it's saying notice is any unilateral communication, offers, counteroffers, etc., from one party to the other. It basically says the notice to and from a broker representing a party is deemed notice. So if I send notice to you that it is accepted to your buyer's agent, and he didn't tell you, but you go find something else and you say, hey, I want to go buy this instead, me having put them on notice means you're under contract. So it is representative to representative. What else? 30, acknowledgement. Parties are solely responsible to verify all wiring instructions with law firms. They're also advised to understand that any audio visual surveillance may occur on the property, so don't chat about the property or anything you don't want people to know while you're in there. However, if the seller does surveil the property, they will make sure that they abide by South Carolina laws. This contract, the South Carolina Disclosure of Real Estate Relationships, any agency agreements and copies of documents, basically that you have received them. If you had any questions beyond the scope of these, that you would talk to a legal counsel about it. Expiration of offer. I'm submitting this offer at this time. You need to get back to me at this time. If you don't get back to me by this time, it could become a voidable contract. And then signatures, everything else signed, sealed, and delivered. And that's Form 310. Questions? That means it's perfectly covered. Well, when you have questions, the reason we do these over and over is because more questions will come. There's no question that has not been asked before, and if it has, that'd be awesome, because then I got to go find the answer for it, which I love doing. But yeah, any questions you have during this, make sure you ask. Yes, sir.
So say the contract is set to expire at 3 p.m. today. I make a change to that contract, initial it, and then shoot it over to the sellers. Say I'm representing the buyers. So I make the initial, shoot it over to the sellers. They agree to it, but they don't get those initials back to those changes back to me until 3/10. At that point, do we need to go and update that expiration date and everyone initial that?
Sorry, it's muted. Yes, it technically does. It becomes a voidable contract at that point.
Okay.
Not an issue till it's an issue.
Yeah, I had an
One of
agent
those
like,
things. It's
respond back to me and she was like, can we just verbally agree through email that the contract is extended? And I was like, I'd prefer if we just change the initial date.
yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for doing that. I appreciate that. I can't tell you how many times I've had eye rolls and everything back to me from agents for technicalities like that. And luckily I've never had to say, haha, I've told you so, this is why we would do it. But it's that one moment where something comes up and it's like, well, it looks like here technically this wasn't initial till after it expired, so we technically don't have a contract or whatever.
Yeah.
That's all it takes. It's all it takes. So
And go ahead. Sorry, Nancy, please.
I have a question about the pre-approval and the mortgage and stuff. So when it says the pre-approval, does that include the appraisal? Does that include, so that's not a mortgage commitment, which would be before the closing? Could you explain that a little bit, clear that up a little bit more?
no, I mean, the pre-approval would be basically from the lender that basically says there are no unrealistic conditions that are required. That would not include the appraisal, though. They could have, because the appraisal is technically separate, right? They could still approve it without the appraisal. The appraisals could be, the appraisal is really more to the house than it is the loan.
Right, but is there a period of time? Because I didn't see in that paragraph anything about when the mortgage commitment is due.
No, it doesn't. That's the whole problem, is it's a pre-approval. And it technically says in there that the final approval is not done until the loan funds. Yeah. Again, not a perfect system.
When does the appraisal part come into play then?
There's not a deadline on it. The appraisal part could come in. The appraisal could come in a couple days beforehand and not appraise, and there's no deadline on that.
Thank you.
Yep. Lane, back to you.
Okay, the sellers have agreed to the terms. They have, well, the sellers have one change to the contract. They initial, send it back to me. We agree to those terms. The buyers initial, send back to the sellers. The sellers say, or we initial say, hey, ratified, sent back to you. Do they need to send us an email or something just saying, hey, we have received this? What is best practice?
No, yeah, some would say acknowledge of receipt. But no, as long as you've sent it to the notice it's actually an important point. The email that's on the last page of the contract for the buyers and sellers agents, as long as it was sent to that is notice of ratification.
Cool.
Which is all you would need.
Awesome.
Yep. All right, guys. Any other questions? Shoot me an email, give me a call. I appreciate y'all being here. I appreciate all the questions. The questions definitely help explain. They bring up things that, have, more than likely happened before, but we haven't talked about it in a while. So I appreciate that. So, all right, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Jason.
Take care.